everything you need to know about raw dog food in 10 minutes, we said, but that was just to get you in. Guys, come on, it's going to be 20 minutes at least of high quality content. I've got it divided into 7 sections. I'm going to, first of all, talk about what do dogs eat, you know, when left to their own devices out in the wild. And there's a few different things you can do to explore that, the diet studies, ancestry, and their gut morphology and that kind of stuff. The second section is what is raw dog food, a very brief, just tell us a little bit about that. 3 is the top 5 benefits, just fly through them and why they are the top 5 benefits that you're going to see, and I'll do them in some form of time order. 4 is where's the proof, where is your evidence, which is such a common question that people that wish to start feeding fresh species appropriate food their pets get asked very regularly. Certainly the more vocal people get asked that a lot. So where's the proof? So I'm going to talk about that proof, and I need about 5 minutes for that to fly through some really important points that you can take on and have a think about. 5 is what exactly should we feed them? So what does the ideal kind of weekly raw dog food meal kind of look like? I hate giving exacts, I hate percentages, I hate all that, as if you eat that way yourself. But some people do need a little bit of direction. And if you need more direction than that, there's articles everywhere to read, you know, and of course I would direct you to dogsfirst.ie, which has fabulous information on it. Question 6 is DIY. How do I make it myself? Lots of stuff we could talk about there, very easy to do. And 7 will be the FAQ section. I'm going to fly through 2 or 3 of the top frequently asked questions, and then we'll get your questions at the end of that. Okay. So I also come in with a few slides now and again, so bear with me as I fumble around trying to get them up. But initially, we want to talk about what do dogs eat, and these are always the first 2 slides of my presentation when I do seminars. These are always my first 2 slides, and I always say to people, okay, guys, you know, you've heard of a carnivore and you've heard of an omnivore, and you know, who thinks the dog is a carnivore? A certain amount of people put up their hands. And who thinks the dog is an omnivore? And a certain amount of people put up their hands. And that's all well and good. But it's not as simple as just talking about carnivore or omnivore, because, you know, these are typical carnivores here. You've got your big cats, crocodilians, your raptor birds. You've got omnivores like the European red fox, black bear, man, or woman, and then herbivore, you've got your cattle, your elephants and your panda bears. So there's typical carnivores, omnivores, herbivores, but it's not as simple as I am an omnivore, feed me an omnivore diet. Because if you were a zookeeper, I'm a zoologist, I have a degree in zoology, I have a doctorate in studying the effects of diet on the behavior and gut morphology of mammals. But zoology was my degree. And so if you're a zoologist and you're handed an animal and told to feed it, you're going to want a bit more information than, okay, he's an omnivore. Well, how much meat does he eat? Does he eat a lot of meat, a little meat? What type of meat? What sort of plants? At what time of the year? You know, these are all really relevant questions. So you'd do well to remember that the European red fox is quite carnivorous. You know, 70, 80% of his life is spent eating animal protein, you know, give or take, compared to the black bear, who eats maybe 20% animal protein. And you can feed one like the other, no problem. But over time, you would expect there to be, it wouldn't have ideal results for the animal. You've got to feed it exactly what it needs in the wild, species appropriate food. And man, of course, is far more herbivorous than they are carnivorous. And even the panda bear isn't a complete herbivore. You know, in times of hunger and nutrient deficiency, they'll take a bit of fish, take a few insects. Maybe a nod to the past, but almost all carnivores will eat some plant matter now and again, be it medicinal or for whatever reason. Any herbivores that grow things like antlers, they'll eat bones off the ground in a flash. They'll eat the legs off a baby bird in a nest because antlers just take so much energy and calcium to grow. They are incredibly deficient of it. Cattle are notorious for it, sheep, everything. So all these animals, it's not just dead set. It's not simple enough to say omnivore. They make it sound that simple because they want to pretend that the animal can actually be fed a huge amount of plant material, when actually that's just not the case. If you are a zoologist and you're given an animal to look after for the first time, there's 3 things you can go about trying to decide what this animal eats in the wild, because what they eat in the wild is probably the best thing to feed them behind the scenes. That's the kind of the key route to health in zoos, and it's certainly we're all going back to paleo in humans, and you know, farm-fed animals are better off when they're fed organically on pasture, as opposed to the stall-fed poor cattle that are force-fed corn and wheat and all that sort of stuff. You know, so not a great way to raise an animal. We know they all need fresh, species-appropriate food. So there's 3 things you can look at. You can look at the ancestry of the dog. Where did he come from? You can look at I just want to show you another slide on ancestry. You can look at the diet studies. So what do these animals eat in the wild when they're left to their own devices? That's very, very telling. And also the biology, the digestive biology of the animal. Like what does this animal eat? If you didn't tell me and I just took them apart and looked at them, what would you say this animal eats? So the evolution thing, you know, I don't want to spend too long on it, but a key slide here, there's some really key points here. Slides guy. So like this is a very incredibly complicated slide, but what it's telling you essentially is the grey wolf was doing his own thing. He's up the top for the last 4 or 5 million years. He was a grey wolf, and then suddenly around 100,000 years ago, for whatever reason, the huge number of food niches popped up, and 37 other wolf species evolved out of the grey wolf. And then maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the dingo separates from the domestic dog. Okay, the domestic dog popped out of maybe 30,000 years ago, and then the dingo and the domestic dog maybe 4,000 years ago. But the point is that the dog has come from a long line of carnivores. All wolves are classified as carnivores. Some will eat some plant material. You'll see wolves in Yellowstone eating some blueberries sometimes, and there's a whole other conversation we can talk about that. But for the very large part, almost all wolves are total carnivores, certainly the grey wolf. So the dog comes from a long line of carnivores. And sometimes people will throw out that, you know, the coyote or the African wild dog is omnivorous. And we'll go, yeah, well, the African wild dog hasn't been related to the domestic dog for 5 million years. And they'll also hold out examples of the maned wolf and say the maned wolf is very omnivorous. In fact, he eats a lot of fruit. And you go, yeah, but that hasn't been a wolf for 6.5 million years, back when we were climbing out of the trees. So it's like us looking at chimpanzees to see what we should feed the kids. Those examples are thrown in there to fudge the data, you know, so any talk about African wild dogs and maned wolf is ridiculous. The most important animal there that we can look at is the dingo. So up the top right there, you've got the domestic dog, Canis lupus familiaris, and Canis lupus dingo. Because the diet studies of the dingo are huge, and we've got massive studies of dingoes crossed with domestic dogs and domestic dogs on their own, all shot out in the outbacks of Australia because they need to preserve the dingo populations. And what they find is the domestic dogs that they shoot in the outbacks of Australia are eating a completely carnivorous diet, 97% animal matter, 3% vegetation. And that vegetation is only coming from the animals that are living in the tropics, eating birds and that kind of thing. So ancestry tells us a lot about what these animals eat. The diet studies are the same, and the diet studies would be very strong because I spent years studying the diet of various deer and group living animals. And the thing about diet studies is they're very confusing. There's 3 different types. You can observe them through a telescope, which is a really poor way of seeing what an animal eats. So a polar bear foraging in a waste dump, and he's, you know, or no, a better example would be a fox in a carrot patch, and he's nibbling at carrots. And you go, oh, he loves carrots. How much carrots is he eating? Well, we don't know, because I think he's actually trying to eat the slugs off the carrots. So it's very confusing. You need to get a sample from the animal, be it a stool sample or a poo sample, which is okay. But the problem with that is plant matter is overrepresented in a stool sample because you digest all the meat and stuff, and you know, plant fiber and stuff passes through. You know, so if you had chicken breast and cabbage, you're gonna have a lot of cabbage in your poo, not so much chicken breast. So those studies are very popular in studying dogs because you don't have to sacrifice them, but they're not as accurate as the best studies, which is that requires the death of the animal, where they take a sample from the stomach. So of those studies, we have very, very little in dogs, very little indeed. And, you know, the ones that we do have of truly feral dogs that are walking around doing their own thing, where humans have never touched them, they're scared. Proper feral dogs are scared of humans. They'd be aggressive towards them. Those studies indicate the dog is very, very carnivorous indeed, but they're not great studies. They're a lot of stool studies and observational studies, but they're very, very carnivorous animals. Unfortunately, the rest of our studies come from village dogs. And village dogs are animals that live with people for the morning. You know, they stay overnight and they sleep outside the hut. It's usually in poor, very poor areas with lax roaming laws. And these dogs are then released out during the day because there's no roaming laws, and they go off to dumps and they forage and they pick and that kind of thing. And the problem is that humans, particularly poorer humans, will feed these animals a lot of plant matter. And studies show that if you feed a dog a lot of plant matter when it's young, he'll eat a lot of plant matter when it's older. You can have a vegetarian cat that won't touch meat. That's not to suggest that that's good for the cat. I mean, there's videos all over the place of cats eating broccoli, but that means nothing because feral cats will not touch vegetable matter, and it's not a good stuff to be feeding them. So it happens with that with all sorts of animals. In fact, with pregnant rats, you can spray apple in the air of pregnant rats twice a day for the last 3 days of birth, and the pups will come out and fight over the apple-tainted nipples. Humans, babies come out looking for the food that they were fed. So you target safe proteins from the time you're in the womb, and this plays havoc with the diet studies and that kind of thing. I'm practically not, because this is definitely where I'm strong. But I can just tell you the diet study is a bit confusing. But of the good ones we have, feral dogs, very, very carnivorous. So everything's pointing towards carnivore here, and it's not going to surprise you when you look at the digestive morphology of the dog. And I have another slide for that. The digestive morphology of the dog is very, very carnivorous. So these are just some of the more these are some of the top traits of the carnivorous dog. So starting at the head, taste receptors are adapted to flesh. In fact, studies of the dog show that if you even taint any food with a bit of meat, they'll eat meat. They are very meat-seeking animals. Every single study indicates that. They want meat, meat, meat. Hinged jaw and jagged teeth, very, very telling. Their jaw only opens up and down, snaps open and closed. That's a carnivore's jaw. Omnivores like us and chimps and that kind of stuff, we move our jaws side to side for grinding plant forage. Dogs don't have those sort of teeth. They've got jagged teeth, carnasal teeth, which slide down past each other like a side. Those teeth can't move from side to side because all they do is chop and chew and swallow large lumps of meat and bone. In fact, one of their teeth is very telling that they eat bone in the first place, their back teeth, the big pyramid one, incredibly impressive tooth. So that's a meat-eating mouth if ever you saw it. I mean, of course, look at the teeth, you know, it's quite obvious. No salivary amylase, which means they haven't been eating plant matter in the past much. Highly elastic stomach, very low pH, like battery acid. Short intestinal tract, very, very short, very fast. No cecum, which means it doesn't slow down its meal. You want the meal to slow down if you want the bacteria to eat it. So humans, omnivores, and particularly herbivores have cecums and dead ends and a big long intestines to slow the forage down so the bacteria can get to work. And we eat what the bacteria provide us then. But dogs have none of that. So they're not very good at digesting plant matter at all. Helps by the fact that the bacterial flora is poorly equipped. So they've got a badly designed system if feeding plant material is going to be the thing you're going to do for them. Most importantly, dogs and cats have zero need for plant carbohydrate. This is, you know, every single biologist that's ever looked at the dog, including the pet food companies, admit that the dog does not need carbohydrates in his diet. That is the exact definition of a carnivore. They make their own blood sugar from protein and fat, okay? So you can feed them carbohydrates, they can digest them. We could go down and talk about that all day, but that's just not to say that this is ideal. They can digest carbohydrates the same way I can digest ethanol and sugar. Does that mean 50% of my diet should be rum and cookies? You know, of course not. But it's a ludicrous kind of analogy. But there is some studies coming out now showing that dogs have developed a few little genes, a few little alleles to indicate they have been eating some carbs in the past. They're slightly better at digesting carbs than cats or wolves, for example. They've got maybe 4 to 32 copies more of a particular gene, an amylase gene from the pancreas. They can digest carbohydrates a bit better than cats. They can utilize glucose twice as good as cats. So definitely some plant matter has been in the dog's diet in the past, and depending on who they grew up with. So if they grew up beside farmers, they're better digesting carbohydrates. If they grew up beside non-farmers and roaming scavengers like Akitas and Huskies, they've got very little copies of this gene, just showing that whoever you grow up with actually dictates, you know, what you need to eat. So they would have been getting some plant scraps, not a whole lot. And these are a tiny handful of adaptions in a body, like thousands of processes are into screaming kind of carnivory. But definitely it has in the past experienced some carbohydrates. It's just not exactly a reason to feed this animal a whole lot of carbohydrates. So that's where we are. What do dogs eat? That usually takes about 3 hours. I've done that in 7 minutes. Okay, so very carnivorous would be the answer. You want to say he eats a bit of veg, and I agree. I think he does eat a bit of veg. If you ask me, I would use 5 to 10% vegetation in his diet for different reasons and different part. You know, I will get to all that, but very carnivorous. And so some people say total carnivore, and they could argue that very effectively that was true. Others might say a bit of plant matter here and there. Studies show that when you do use plant matter, particularly in dry-fed dogs, it's incredibly effective at certain things. You know, just unbelievable studies there. So that's a long section, but the rest of them are quite quick.